Evening. The group chat lights up with another message. Someone is inviting everyone out to meet up, hang out, get out of the house for a while. Your phone is lying nearby. You see the message immediately. You see the replies coming in, people agreeing so easily, as if there is not the slightest resistance inside them. And in that moment, a strange feeling rises in you. Not panic, not anger, not contempt. Something quieter and heavier, as if the very thought of getting dressed again, going out, holding a conversation, reacting, smiling, being engaged, is already draining your energy. You look at the door, beyond which the noisy world is waiting, and suddenly you feel with unusual clarity how good it is here, in your own light, in your own silence, in your own territory where you do not have to perform anything, endure anything, or explain anything. And usually people find a simple, convenient explanation for this very quickly. They say that people like this are just lazy, too withdrawn, not interested in life, bad at communication, afraid of the world, used to hiding in their shell, but almost always that explanation is too cheap for such a complex inner reality. Because love of home is very often born not from emptiness but from depth, not from weakness but from a particular way of feeling the world, not from a lack of interest in people, but from the very high price that contact sometimes demands. And today we are going to look at what people usually do not see, not a simple habit of staying home, but the hidden psychological truth about people who genuinely feel best in solitude, about those who are too often seen as cold, strange, or difficult, even though much more is happening inside them than it seems. If you have ever felt that at home you somehow get yourself back, while around other people you slowly lose yourself, then stay until the end. There may be more truth about you here than you expect, and if at some point you recognize yourself in this, support this video with a like and subscribe. And now let us begin. Silence is a way not to fall apart. There are people for whom noise is not just a loud sound. It is intrusion. It is pressure on the nervous system. It is a constant microscopic tension that other people barely notice. Psychologists have long spoken about different levels of sensitivity to stimulation. For one person, bright light. Conversations, notifications, crowds, other people's eyes and other people's emotions only brush against the surface. For another, all of it goes too deep, too close, too fast. And that is when home becomes more than just a place. It becomes a filter, a space where you can finally remove the excess noise and hear what is actually happening inside you. Not because you do not love life, but because your psyche handles an overload of signals more poorly than others do. You can go to an ordinary shopping centre, spend an hour there, and come home feeling as if you worked a brutal shift. You can spend an evening in a group where everything is technically fine, nobody hurt you, nothing terrible happened, and yet at night you lie there in the dark and feel as if something inside you has been stretched to the limit. From the outside, it can look almost ridiculous. What is the big deal? Just people, just conversations, just music, just a noisy day. But for you, it is not just that. Because your nervous system does not switch off the excess as easily as other people's does. It absorbs, it processes, it carries every unnecessary stimulus a little longer than you wish it would. And it is very easy to feel ashamed of that, especially if you were told that you make everything too complicated, react too intensely, get tired too quickly, are too fragile for ordinary life. But sometimes the issue is not that you are weak. Sometimes the issue is that you are built more finely. And fineness always costs more. It pays a higher price for every touch of the world. And still, this trait has another side. If a person hides only from overload all the time, they begin to confuse peace with life and safety with fullness of existence. They protect themselves, but gradually narrow the space in which they can breathe. So love of home can be not only a form of protection, but also an invisible cage. Remember one thing. Not everyone who chooses silence is running from life. Sometimes they are simply trying not to dissolve in its noise, selectiveness mistaken for coldness. There are people who do not need many connections in order to feel alive. They do not need an endless circle of friends, constant meetups, non-stop texting, and a sense of social involvement at any cost. What matters more to them is not quantity, but quality. Not just any person nearby, but that rare feeling that someone truly real is beside them. From a psychological point of view, this is often connected to a deep need for meaningful contact. Not a formal exchange of lines, not a polite social game, but the experience of real connection. These people get tired of superficial communication faster because it requires energy while giving almost nothing back. You can sit in a group for hours, listen to conversations about everything and nothing, nod, keep the topic going, even smile, and inside you, a strange emptiness will slowly begin to build. As if you are surrounded by people, and yet no contact is happening at all, and this is where others often get it wrong. They think you are arrogant, too closed off, too demanding when it comes to people, as if nobody is ever good enough for you. But sometimes the truth is much less convenient. You simply feel too well the difference between closeness and its imitation, between a living conversation and social noise, between a place where you are truly seen and a place where you are only playing a role. You can notice it in the most ordinary moments, when someone invites you somewhere just for the sake of fun, and you already feel the inner fatigue in advance. When you read a long message thread and realize that after dozens of messages, nothing real happened at all. When you leave someone's birthday party, and instead of a warm aftertaste, all you feel is the heaviness of how many words were said for nothing. But there is a price here too. The more selective a person is, the harder it is for them to find their own people. The longer the loneliness lasts between those rare, genuine encounters, and then love of home becomes not only a preference, but also compensation. If the world offers no depth, you retreat to the one place where at least there is no falseness. That is why some people stay home not because they do not like people, but because they feel far too well when there is conversation without connection. A rich inner world that cannot be seen from the outside. There are people who are not bored in solitude, and this is one of the hardest things to understand for those who are used to drowning in a silence in the constant presence of others. Because for some, staying home means getting stuck with emptiness, but for others it means finally entering the space where real inner life begins. Psychology has long known that some people rely not so much on an outer stream of impressions as on an inner processing of reality. They think a great deal, build a great deal inwardly, live through a great deal inside. Their inner dialogue is stronger, their imaginative thinking is stronger, their ability to unfold entire worlds from one memory, one thought, one feeling is stronger. Such people can sit in silence and not be lonely, because something is always happening inside them. You may have noticed this in yourself. Outwardly, the day may look empty. You went nowhere, barely saw anyone, nothing vivid happened. But inside you lived an entire life. You remembered an old conversation, finished the thought you never said back then, replayed a future situation, imagined dozens of possibilities, understood something about yourself, caught some elusive feeling that you could not name before. And that inner process is so full that afterward you do not need additional entertainment to feel that the day meant something. That is exactly why people who love staying home so often seem incomprehensible to others. From the outside they look like they are doing nothing, but inside enormous work is happening. And society almost never respects that invisible life. It respects outer activity, busyness, movement, noise, display. But quiet inner richness almost always looks like idleness to it. But there is no need to romanticize this too much. A rich inner world can be not only a gift, but also a trap. Because a person who is used to living inwardly sometimes begins to fear the outer world precisely because of its roughness. Reality is too sharp, people are too noisy, events are too unpredictable. Inside, everything is deeper, more precise, cleaner. And gradually a temptation appears to choose inner life almost completely, leaving outer life at a minimum. So it is important to understand one subtle thing. If you feel good at home, that does not mean you have dropped out of life. It may simply mean that you live not only on the outside, but also at a depth many people never even reach. Sometimes the loudest space a person has is not around them, but within them. Home as a territory of control. Many people do not love home because of the walls, the tea, the blanket, or the familiar couch. They love it for something else, for predictability, for the fact that here, everything is in its place. Here, nobody suddenly invades your psyche. Here you get to decide when to speak, when to be silent, when to engage, when to disappear. And for a person whose past contained too much chaos, that possibility becomes almost sacred. The psyche always remembers not only events, but also the level of control you had within those events. If there was too much unpredictability, pressure, criticism, emotional instability, or intrusion into personal boundaries in the past, a person begins to especially value any space where they can finally be the owner of their own reality. Home then becomes not just a domestic place, but a symbol of restored authority over one's own life. This shows up in small things. You get irritated if someone changes your plans without warning. It is hard for you to be in a space where people constantly want something from you. You get tired not only from communication, but from the very necessity of always being available. And when you come home, you feel relief almost physically, as if your body exhales before your mind has even had time to notice it. From the outside, this can look like a strange attachment to your comfort zone, as if the person simply spoiled themselves with convenience and now does not want to step into the real world. But for some people, home is not luxury and not weakness. It is the place where inner anxiety connected to loss of control finally stops, where they can stop scanning everything around them, where they do not have to remain on guard all the time. But hidden in this is a painful question. If a person becomes too attached to a controlled environment, they begin to lose flexibility. The world outside the home feels more and more aggressive because you cannot predict everything there. And then home starts to save them, while at the same time making them even more sensitive to any violation of the familiar order. Remember this, sometimes a person clings to home not because they are afraid of space, but because they lived too long in places where they had no right to inner safety. Exhaustion from superficial roles. There is a special kind of fatigue that people rarely talk about out loud. It is not physical tiredness and not the ordinary need to rest. It is exhaustion from the constant performance of a social role. From the fact that among other people, you're too often not simply existing, but presenting a version of yourself that is easier to accept. More convenient, simpler, more understandable. Psychology knows that a person almost always adjusts to their environment, changes their tone, facial expression, pace of speech, degree of openness, even their own reactions. That is normal. But for some, this adaptation happens easily and almost invisibly. For others, it consumes an enormous amount of energy, especially if inside you are more complex, quieter, more anxious, deeper, or more contradictory than the situation allows. You can come to a gathering and after only 20 minutes feel that you are not living, but functioning, maintaining the right level of engagement, producing understandable reactions, smiling at the right moments, not showing irritation, not showing fatigue, not showing that what you really want is silence, and at some point you catch yourself in a disturbing thought. I'm not even sure that I am really here right now. That is why some people feel so good at home. At home, the need to constantly be readable, convenient, and socially acceptable falls away. There, you do not have to hold your face together, do not have to shape yourself into an acceptable form, do not have to monitor how your words sound, do not have to correct every reaction. And in that freedom, what appears is not laziness, but a basic need to stop performing. But this too has a dark side. When a person lives too long only in spaces where they do not need to adapt, any external environment starts to feel like violence, and then they go out into the world less and less, not because the world is always bad, but because the cost of being present in it feels too high. So it is not always about disliking people. Sometimes a person is simply deathly tired of how often being around people forces them to stop being themselves. The heaviest form of loneliness is not when you are alone. It is when you are among people and you are not there. Solitude as restoration, not punishment. There are people who, after a hard day, are drawn not toward company, but toward silence. Not because they are offended by the world, not because they have nothing to say, but because it is precisely in solitude that their psyche knows how to repair itself. For them, being alone is not emptiness, but a workshop of recovery. This is especially characteristic of those who strongly absorb other people's states. You do not have to be openly emotional to get tired of other people's moods. Sometimes you're simply sitting nearby, nothing special is happening, and yet after a conversation with someone anxious, demanding, chaotic, or heavy, something remains inside you, as if part of their energy sticks to you and does not leave right away. And then home becomes the place where you slowly peel other people off yourself. You probably know this feeling. You come home, you close the door, and only then do you realize how tense you were all day, how much you were adjusting to other people's rhythms, other people's expectations, other people's moods, and then you sit in the silence, maybe not even doing anything important, maybe just staring at one point, walking around the room, drinking water, lying there in the half-dark, And it is exactly in those moments that the psyche begins to slowly return to itself. From the outside, that kind of recovery is often dismissed. It looks as if the person is simply wasting time meaninglessly, lying there, silent, avoiding life. But sometimes silence is work. Sometimes stillness is not emptiness, but a way of returning to your inner center. Sometimes solitude heals better than any advice. And still, there is a risk here. If a person becomes used to recovering only in complete isolation, they may begin to perceive all relationships as sources of depletion. Then they no longer build closeness, they only recover from contact, and that is no longer freedom, but a slow retreat. But it is important to name the truth. Not every form of solitude is a sign of a wound. Sometimes it is a natural form of psychological hygiene, a way to stay alive in a world where too much of what is not yours passes through you. Some people need silence not to hide, but to gather themselves back together. A hidden pride in not being like everyone else. There is one more trait that people almost never talk about because it is uncomfortable. Love of home is sometimes connected not only with sensitivity, exhaustion, or the need for silence. Sometimes there is also a quiet inner protest in it, a refusal to live according to the pattern society imposes as the only correct one, as if real life must always be constant gatherings, movement, noise, displays of happiness, involvement, ease, sociability. And if that does not suit you, people quickly start looking at you as if something is wrong with you. But some people at a certain point stop obeying that model, not always consciously, sometimes even uncertainly. But they stop all the same. They begin choosing not what looks correct, but what matches their inner structure. And in that choice there is not only exhaustion, but dignity. Not loud dignity, not aggressive dignity, quiet dignity, almost invisible, but very firm. You may have run into this when people tried to remake you. They told you that you should go out more, be easier, be more spontaneous, be more alive. And the whole problem is that when they say be more alive, what they often really mean is be more convenient for someone else's version of life. Be the kind of person who does not force others to explain your depth, who does not force them to confront your selectiveness, who does not force them to accept that for some people, what feels good is not what feels good to the majority. And here, love of home becomes almost a form of identity, not a whim, but a quiet statement. I do not have to live the way people say I should. I do not have to spend myself in order to fit someone else's norm. I do not have to treat noise as proof of a full life, but honesty matters here too. Inner independence can easily disguise itself as pride, and pride can disguise itself as maturity. Sometimes a person truly is protecting themselves from imposed rules, and sometimes they are simply turning their closeness into an ideology so they do not have to face the difficulty of closeness, risk, and real contact. And that is a subtle line, one that matters. And yet, in itself, love of home does not make you broken. There may be in it a rare ability not to betray your own psyche just to match the crowd. Not everyone who stays home is lost to the world. Sometimes they have simply refused to live by someone else's script. And if we now gather all of this together, the picture becomes completely different. Love of home is not always about fear, not always about laziness, not always about being closed off. Sometimes it is the trace of high sensitivity, sometimes the trace of selectiveness, sometimes the sign of a rich inner life, sometimes an attempt to regain control, sometimes a way of restoring yourself after other people's emotions, sometimes a quiet refusal to pretend that what actually destroys you is somehow right for you. Yes, all of this has a price. Such people face misunderstanding more often. It is easier to call them strange than to truly hear them. It is harder for them to find their own people, harder to explain why they get tired of what energizes others, why things that look fun to everyone else can feel heavy to them, why silence is not punishment for them, and why coming home means returning not only to an apartment, but to themselves. And if you recognize yourself in this, then maybe your problem is not that you are wrong. Maybe you are simply built more deeply than people expected. Maybe you are not broken, but spent too long living in a world that measures the fullness of life only by the level of noise. Maybe you do not avoid people, but simply know too well how expensive their presence can sometimes be. Maybe you're not cold. Maybe you just cannot live on the surface, and there is no reason to make yourself into something special because of that. But there is no reason to be ashamed of it either. Because for you, home may be not a shelter from the world, but the place where your personality stops falling apart into roles, reactions, overload, and other people's expectations, the place where you become whole again. The most important thing is not whether you love staying home. The most important thing is why it is easier for you to breathe there, because the answer to that question may tell more about you than hundreds of noisy gatherings and proper social masks ever could. And perhaps true maturity begins at the moment when you stop being ashamed of your silence and begin to understand its language. Because not everyone who chooses solitude is running from the world. Sometimes they are simply too deep to live only on its surface,